Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be reviewing the 2021 season of Big Brother Australia, the second season of this BBAU reboot, where they have attempted to make the game a bit more similar to the US version of the show, or really just make it more like an in-house version of Australian Survivor, with again feeling like a mix of the older Big Brother format and the social strategy game that we typically see from Survivor. And through that, last season, while it was attempting to get two different types of audiences, I don't feel like it really ended up appealing to either of them, lacking a focus on strategy and showing the dynamics of the house to fully understand what was going on in the game, while also being a bit too strategically focused at points to appeal to the more casual audience that doesn't want that sort of thing. And to me, this season didn't really fix any of that. Obviously, I would have liked for them to embrace the strategy, and to be honest, I kind of thought they were going to. Coming into the season, I expected them to fix the mistakes of last season, but instead we really got more of the same, a season with very similar issues. But I will say that despite the numerous missteps that this season had, I ended up enjoying this season a lot more than last season. I mean, it did feel like the gameplay was a lot more dynamic. And there was one character in particular that did get a ridiculously large edit and was such a focal point on the season, but he was such a great character that I felt like he carried this season. But overall, though, I still don't like this format. I don't like how I barely knew half the cast. I don't like the numerous production decisions that were made throughout the season that made the game unfair, but I guess that's kind of what you got to expect from BBAU at this point. But like my other reviews, I will be running through the season episode by episode. I got a lot to talk about here, so let's get started off with the premiere, which starts off pretty similarly to last season, and you instantly get the vibe that they have no intention of changing up the formula that they used last season. You can still tell that they're trying to copy off Australian Survivor, of us constantly getting shots of the shore with like Australian Survivor-esque music playing in the background that takes us back from commercial. I mean, we do get players being added in 3 at a time here, with a lot of focus being on these first 3 that enter, with Mel getting this sob story about her farm. It really felt like they were trying to give her like a Matt-esque edit from last season, though she obviously has a much shorter run here. Nick was mostly just there to boon the edit of the other person, who was Daniel. And Dan is the aforementioned person where the edit on this season is ridiculous in his favor. Where, I mean, like, yeah, he's shown negatively at points, but he gets a very, like, Russell Hantz Samoa-esque edit here, with him clearly being the star of the show and seemingly being the most active player throughout the season. And I personally found him to be really fun here, especially with him coming off as this like Michael Scott-esque figure, like instantly talking about how this is his house now, and he tries to prank Melissa into thinking that he's a 70-year-old, and he gets a secret mission very early on where he gets to potentially get immunity if he's able to escape the house undetected through a hidden passageway in the cave, and he has to pick a partner in crime, who he does end up picking Nick. And their dynamic here was a lot of fun to me. I mean, Nick being the straight man to Dan's like ridiculous comments and actions. Now we do eventually meet Katie as well, and we instantly see the awkwardness between her and Dan, which leads up to their rivalry later down the road. We also get introed to Max, who we find out is Katie's ex, which is bizarre. And I really felt like this came off to me as more of a mistake in casting than like a purposeful twist, as it just kind of comes out of nowhere. But I did also find it like really terrible gameplay for like Katie to just reveal this to everyone right away. Seemed to be an easy thing to put a target on their backs. But this first initial group does end up being only 12 players, which again, kind of bizarre considering the cast ends up being 26 players. And while I get the concept of not wanting to have too many people to introduce at once, I do also just hate the concept of having players come in late onto the season. And with the season, over half of the people end up doing so. But after the intros, we do get Dan executing his plan where he tries to force Nick down the passageway. And this is a really fun segment, as you can clearly tell that like Nick wants nothing to do with this, and Dan is just getting frustrated with him the entire time, and all that was really fun. After this, we do get the return of Big Brother just messing with the players, which I typically don't find that entertaining. But here we have BB allowing them to create a list of demands just for them to throw all of their demands into a wood chipper. And again, we get numerous segments like this throughout the season. It really feels like that's the typical trope that BB relies on, messing with the players throughout the season. We do get the first nomination challenge, which again, we get the confirmation that the format is pretty much exactly the same as last season, where the winner of this challenge has to nominate 3 people, and after that we just get into a straight up vote. Again, as long as the episodes are, which every episode is well over an hour, I would have liked to get rid of these tasks and instead add in a veto competition similar to the US and Canadian versions. I think that would have added a more dynamic game here, though to be fair, this house was pretty dynamic to begin with, and I think that did kind of save the season from its pretty stale format. But during the challenge, we do have SJ getting this really heroic edit for no reason, and really she constantly gets this edit throughout the season, and really just felt like the editors were really trying to prop her up to be this fan favorite figure. But out of nowhere, Renata wins here, and I did find it strange how they actually do give her some time to think about the noms, but she's still not allowed to talk about them with anybody, which is just dumb. And also, they just don't do this moving forward, where we go back to the instant nominations moving forward, which again, it's like they're trying to have this strategy game, but trying to also sap all of the actual strategy from it. It's like they're trying to get the credit for having the social strategy game without actually allowing these players to play the social strategy game. But here we do also get introduced to the Max and Christina showmance, the first of 3 showmances for Christina this season. But we do see the initial power structure revolving around Max. But for Renata not being in that power structure, she ends up putting up Max and Christina, along with using her own ally in Melissa as a pawn, which seemed to be a continuation of last season where people used their own allies as pawns for no reason. Again, just leaving her pretty prime there to be getting voted out. And it does seem like Melissa was going to go home here. To which I also find it strange how Katie was being edited as this massive swing vote here, when in reality she was very firmly on Max's side. But we do get to the eviction room where we get a twist that Nick and Dan are obviously safe, but they also get the sole votes in the eviction, where they can even vote to vote no one out if they wanted to. This is obviously entirely unfair. I mean, considering how Dan and Nick were only in the house for not even one night and barely got to talk to the other players. But I'm going to be honest, while I recognize how unfair it is, I don't really care. Because, again, you can clearly tell production doesn't care about the game of the show, so why should I care that much? I mean, again, realistically, it is a major gripe with the show that there is such clear production influence here. And again, they clearly don't care about the integrity of the game. But in most circumstances, it does make for better TV. But this does lead to a massive move here from Dan, where right off the bat, he becomes the sole vote to evict Max. Let's talk about Max. I mean, again, he massively gets screwed over by his twist. It does very much seem like he would have been safe if that had not been the case. But again, I'm kind of fine with it. This is Big Brother Australia. Who cares? I'll be honest that by the end of the season, I barely remembered Max even existed, even though he does have a pretty big role in the premiere here, and he did seem to be a pretty massive player, with him having about half the house being on his side. It did seem like he was going to survive this first round if it weren't for a twist. And again, ideally, if this was Big Brother US, Big Brother Canada, Survivor US, I would care a lot more, but this is Big Brother Australia. So really, I don't really care about how much he was screwed over, because it did end up making for some pretty good TV. Now for episode 2, where we see the ramifications of the Max boot, where we see Katie now talking about how she's alone, which makes no sense based on the dynamics that we saw in the premiere, but whatever. We do also see Mel getting a secret mission to hide different types of sheep throughout the house, and while at first I thought this was really dumb, I did actually find it pretty fun by the end of it, especially when she was given a life-size one to hide. But then we get introduced to the second batch of players here, this batch of 8, where in pairs they are put into this airplane set, where we get this dumb sequence of them pretending to fly to the Big Brother house and BB messing with them along the way. Again, really did nothing for me entertainment-wise, but there are some pretty massive figures on this season from this second batch of players here, especially considering how a lot of the earlier bits of the season actually end up being from the original batch. We then get more Dan content, with him showing more of his Michael Scott self and him not being able to pronounce Renata's name, who at this point is supposed to be one of his closest allies. And really, Dan is shown here to have this massive alliance around him at this point, which really comes out of nowhere. But they are targeting Katie coming into the nomination challenge, and we do see Melissa winning the comp, so she does go through with it in nomming Katie, SJ as Katie's closest ally, and Lil for seemingly no reason. But after the noms, we do get Lil talking about how she's not going to campaign and she's just going to be social, which, considering she was on the outside of the power structure, that didn't seem to be a good move, especially considering it didn't seem like anyone was that close to her. But we do have Katie campaigning to Dan and convincing him to keep her around as a threat to use as a shield. And this seems to fully work on Dan, where he shifts his target on the SJ, but that doesn't seem to stick as Lil gets voted out at the end of the episode here with very little explanation on the show. I think another consequence of Dan just getting so much airtime, where like we literally see like Dan's thought process throughout this entire season, and it's just clear that he didn't have all the control in the game to actually get what he wanted done at all times. So there are a lot of points in the season where like it seems like the vote might be going one way, largely because Dan is so focused on the edit and wanting to get this person out, but then it turns out that they just don't get taken out. And Lil was one of those people. But let's talk about Lil, who I don't have much to talk about. I mean, she got no content in the premiere. Her content in the second episode here was mostly around how she wasn't going to do anything and just be social, which clearly wasn't working. So Lil was someone that pretty much brought nothing to the show for me, which is a shame considering she seemed like she would have been a great character coming into the season. But now for episode 3, where only a few of the new players get any real focus here, with like Tilly getting a majority of it early on, of Tilly being shown as this pretty fun character through her naivety and her frankness. We get a pretty boring balloon popping task where everyone ends up winning the reward, which again felt really pointless. This episode does mostly revolve around Katie, though, who does play this episode pretty well here, where she's able to use the new players here to build a counter alliance to Dan's, with Jess becoming her new ride or die, and Jess also getting a lot of content here, especially when she finds out that her grandmother is dying from cancer, which is a pretty emotional moment. Though from a storytelling perspective, it was kind of bizarre, as we go from barely even knowing her to finding out this pretty dramatic news. But Katie's alliance does end up targeting Renata and Mel over Dan, as they are looked at as the better competitors in the group. And also Renata ends up annoying the other players as well. We do end up with the nom challenge, where it comes down to Jess and Melissa, where Jess makes a deal for Melissa to keep her safe, only for Jess to then win the competition and right away go against this deal, putting Renata, Mel, and Sid on the block, which felt like a really dumb move to me, instantly coming off as untrustworthy to the entire house. As, again, she made this deal right in front of everybody. But Renata ends up acting really pissed and ends up getting into an argument with Jess over how she was manipulated by Katie, which was a really bad look and made it pretty clear that she was going to get voted out here, which she does with 14 votes, which I believe is the most from this season. And Renata was kind of just there. I mean, it's really bizarre because she does win that first challenge, but despite that, she doesn't get that much screen time in that premiere, and really the entire season up until this point. I mean, her blow up was really her most memorable moment for me. I mean, she seemed like one of these people that really couldn't separate game from personal and didn't seem to have any real semblance of a strategic mind, considering how she almost sent home her own ally in that first round. And now for episode 4, which these next few episodes end up getting labeled as Surprise Week, and this is something this season does moving forward, and to be fair, they did this last season as well, where each week's worth of episodes, they try to brand it as a certain type of week, which, again, really just felt like them shoehorning a theme for the sake of branding. But out of nowhere, we do get the intro to Michael, who had gotten no content up until this point, which gets screened out to me as him being the pretty clear boot this episode. We do get this dumb karaoke task where they had to sing while being surrounded by critters, which they end up losing when Charlotte quits, leading to her being an easy pawn moving forward. This episode does also have a lot of Nick content, with him being called the sheriff and him trying to sniff out the new player alliance, and is worried about SJ and Katie flipping. And this seems to cause a pretty blatant split in the house, with the new players targeting Nick and Dan, while most of the OG players agree to stick together. But none of this ends up mattering, because we end up getting random teams put together at the nomination challenge, leading to half the house having immunity and having to agree on their noms, which leads to the winning team here putting up the people that have the least amount of ties, leading to Michael and Tilly being the two main noms, with Mary being used as a pawn, which felt like a really bad move from the new players on the winning team, as it really seemed like they didn't realize that all the noms here were new players. And this vote ends up being very tight, actually, where it ends up being a fight for pawns, where Katie's group wants to save Michael while Dan's group wants to save Tilly. Get a 9-8 vote where Tilly ends up staying, largely due to the new players being pretty divided here on who to keep, with people like Mary and Ari siding with Tilly. And as I said, Michael goes home. I mean, he was there. Another early boot who doesn't get that much screen time. I mean, he seems like a nice guy. I have nothing really bad to say about him, but he clearly was an afterthought in edit, and again felt like a pawn in the game with him being a number for Katie. And to be honest, that's really what a lot of this early game ends up being, with the Katie-Dan war continuing on and both of them staying in the game for quite a while they try to undercut each other along the way. Now for episode 5, which continues the Dan and Katie feud, with Chris now out of nowhere getting content and being talked about as one of the core figures within Katie's alliance, and also him getting personal content here about being a magician, again making him look like the really obvious boot here. But it was fun to see Dan and Katie arguing, with Dan straight up telling her that he's going to put her up, which he does numerous times over the course of this season. But this leads to Katie and Chris talking about targeting Dan and putting him up against 2 pawns, while Dan and Nick overhear this plan, causing Dan to now target Chris, leading to the Nom Challenge where they end up playing in pairs, and Melissa and Tilly, 2 of Dan's biggest allies at this point, winning the challenge, leading to Chris being the target, with SJ and Charlotte being used as pawns. But Katie's alliance here does try to save him by voting for Charlotte, though Charlotte ends up getting no content in this episode, making it kind of even more apparent that Chris is going home. So he does end up getting voted out here in an 8-6 vote. And Chris was another player that was just there. I mean, he seems to have a decent mind for the game. Mind you, I think he played a bit too out in front and seemed to become a target because of that. He seemed like one of the more capable players out of the ones booted so far, but again, didn't really add that much to the show from a character standpoint, and to me comes off as pretty forgettable here. Now for episode 6, where we do get a lot of segments that I found pretty boring, from Carlos getting a dance punishment, to Nick needing a stylist, to the shopping task of having to deactivate these alarms around the house, to Mitchell having this crush on Christina, which ends up starting her second showmance of the season. And early on, I mean, that's really all the screen time that Christina gets, is whenever she has like some sort of showmance, as she isn't really that important to the storyline outside of that until a bit later in the season. We do also get some drama from Katie and SJ taking over the shopping after the task, leading to them buying a whole bunch of moisturizer and 6 packs of tofu, which pisses off most of the house. But really, all this episode seemed to be an SJ boot setup. And we do get to the Nom Challenge where, for some reason, they play in pairs again, even though there's an odd number of players here. So conveniently, we get a random draw where Katie gets to sit out and also conveniently gets immunity. We do end up with Dan and Christina winning the challenge. Obviously, he would have targeted Katie, but now she's safe. And with Christina essentially just letting Dan do whatever he wants here, he ends up targeting SJ while using Sid and Mary as pawns. And up to the boot, the rest of the episode is just kind of boring, where SJ, again, is the clear target. She's obviously getting voted out. But when she is voted out, we do learn that this is a fake double eviction, and we get an immediate second vote between the other 2 noms, where it ends in a tie, where Dan and Christina end up voting out Mary. And this leads to SJ and Mary ending up living in the attic and get to return around later with no repercussions, which they did this last season for Angela, but this seemed even more unfair than that, considering it was 2 players coming back to the game. But also, mind you, both of them did get voted out due to some unfair circumstances. SJ did get unlucky with Katie getting immunity, while Mary got unlucky with the fact that there was the second vote to begin with. So again, all of this is unfair, but it's still not great to see. It really just feels like they added this twist in just for the sake of it, and I didn't like the ramifications that this had on the next episode. And now for episode 7, where a lot of the episode revolves around SJ and Mary being in the attic and learning that Dan is running the game and listening in on his conversations and numerous DRs and getting to talk to certain players within the game, convincing them to flip against Dan. And all this is complete BS from a game perspective, though to be fair, I do think Dan also handles this pretty poorly, where through that last round he does piss off Sid, to the point where Sid was already planning on flipping on Dan anyway. But still, I don't like that he was directly told to do so by SJ and Mary by the end of the episode. Plus, also they get to talk to Katie, and they pretty much just tell her the entire power structure of the house, which again, really unfair in my eyes, but again, this is Big Brother Australia. What do you expect? Now, Dan and his core alliance do end up getting saved here by Tilly winning the nom challenge and targeting Jess and putting up Carlos and Charlotte as pawns. Again, none of these people in Dan's core alliance, though obviously getting rid of Jess, Katie's closest ally, would have been Dan's best move. But with this anti-Dan sentiment starting up here, the floaters decide to flip the vote against Carlos for some reason. And it's never really explained on the show why Carlos seemed to be not well liked by most of the cast, and for me, it really seemed like a really drastic move to be making here. I mean, they really just flip the house, alert Dan to the fact that they are now against him, just to get rid of Carlos? I mean, if it had been Dan, Nick, or Mel on the block, it would have made sense to flip the vote here. But for Carlos, who, again, no one cares about, it just seemed like they were making a move just to make a move. But we do lose Carlos here, and at the end of the episode, we do have SJ and Mary returning to the game, again, without consequence, and really coming out of their evictions actually in a better spot than they were previously, especially now with them being locked in together as a pair. Before moving on, let's talk about Carlos, who I found to be a bizarre figure on the show here, as he was clearly someone that production liked, and someone that BB had fun messing around with, and was pretty prominent on the show because of that, but really didn't have anything else really going on. I mean, yes, he was a fun character that had like this prominent storyline of his love of coffee, but as a player, he just doesn't do anything here, and just seemed to be going rogue at every opportunity to where people probably didn't trust him because of that. Now let's move on to episode 8, where we do get more of this Mitchell-Christina showmance that was just, again, really awkward to me because it was really forced, and you can clearly tell that Christina was just not into it, and it was just BB forcing them to go on a date together because they're obsessed with shoving showmances down our throats. But we also get a push me button appearing in the backyard that just felt like, well, one, filler to waste time in the episode, but also a way for the producers to blatantly manipulate the game in the way that they wanted it to play out. We also get a lot of Dan and Nick talking about how they're on the outs and them complaining to Big Brother, which was a pretty fun scene, but they also try to create a truce with Katie, Jess, and Marley, but it clearly doesn't end up working. We do get to the nom challenge where Tilly wins once again, with Katie coming in second once again, which is a common occurrence on this season. Mainly because a lot of these competitions end up being endurance comps that really test a lot of the same skills. I obviously would have rather have had much more varied competitions, kind of similar to BBUS, but instead they're kind of going for the Survivor-esque sort of challenges, and through that a lot of them end up being the same. But with Tilly being the nominator, Dan gets lucky once again, as Tilly's strategy is to keep both Dan and Katie in the house so they go against each other. So instead she ends up putting SJ, Mitch, and Sid with SJ as her target. Now immediately after this, Nick does hit the button and gets the power to put one of the nominees in a cage for the rest of the day. And I found the wording of this twist to be a bit confusing, as I was under the assumption that the caged person would be immune. But no, they're still nominated, and Nick does make the mistake of picking his closest ally of the three in Mitchell, making it so Mitchell can't campaign, with Mitchell being closer to Dan and Sid and SJ both being part of the current majority. Mitchell does get voted out here, with Christina voting for him as well, which I found kind of humorous. But let's talk about Mitchell, who clearly felt like the second coming of Ian from last season. I mean, he was another socially awkward guy that loved animals, and he ends up being a relatively early boot despite being in the initial majority. It's literally the exact same story, just with the added bit about his crush on Christina, to which again I found that storyline very awkward. But I do think he seems like a nice guy, again, like a lot of people in this cast. Like, he seems like a decent person. I have nothing really bad to say about him as a person, but he just wasn't given as much content as I would have liked. So at the end of the day, again, doesn't really play that much of a factor on this season. Now for episode 9, where we do get more button shenanigans that I found pretty boring. The only exception to me was us having Dan have to play Floor is Lava and messing it up by the end. Also through this episode, we do get letters from home, which were pretty boring, but gameplay-wise, a lot of this episode does feel like a repeat of what was set up last episode, where we get more of Dan, Nick, and Mel being at the bottom, though this time we do see more of Mel with her talking about how she's not going down with the ship, and this leads to her in the next 2 episodes having to throw her own allies under the bus. We literally get the exact same truce talk again between Dan and Katie, This time with an agreement actually being made, though Katie's side obviously plans on going back on it. Which, like, Jess is the one to bring this idea up. And it's funny to me that, like, when she does so, it's like she's thinking of it as, like, this innovative strategy when, like, this is kind of the obvious thing to do. But after this, we do get some more game BS here, where this time it benefits Dan, where Dan gets up early in the morning, goes to the DR, where it's revealed that he has a fever, and as a precaution, he will be isolated, having to miss out on the nomination challenge, inconveniently getting immunity for the round due to this situation. Now, I don't doubt that Dan had a fever, but to just straight up give him immunity on the round where he was clearly the target for the majority coming into it, really just felt like they were trying to keep him in the game. But we do get to the nom challenge where, again, another endurance comp coming down to Katie versus Tilly, but Katie actually ends up winning this one, and she clearly goes for Dan's alliance, nominating Nick and Mel, along with Ari as a pawn. Now, again, I do think Dan probably goes home here if he was eligible, though Nick is pretty blatantly pissed off at Katie and Jess here, and I do wonder if that would have put the target onto him anyway, but we do get to the vote where, I'll be honest, I was actually thinking that Mel was going home here. I was actually surprised to see Nick get voted out here, especially like in a near unanimous vote. As again, I was thinking that Mel was the bigger comp threat of the three. I thought they'll be getting rid of her because of that, but obviously I was wrong. Let's talk about Nick, who I liked. I mean, I liked him as like the straight man to Danny. Outside of that, though, he was just kind of fine. He just seems like the typical type of person you would see on any given season of an Australian reality show. This normal, mellow, nice guy that probably has like a few quirks in him, but doesn't end up being the most entertaining person in the show, but does come off as likable to the more casual audience. From a gameplay standpoint, he seemed to be okay at comps, he seemed to be okay socially, but probably a bit too naive to have any real shot of getting to the end of the game. Now for episode 10, where miraculously Dan is all better and returns to the game, where he learns that Nick was voted out and that Mel went along with it. And when I saw this in the preview, I was like, well, this has got to be a red herring, right? Like, no way he's actually pissed off at Mel for this. But no, he was actually pissed off, which really felt dumb to me, especially considering how he literally does the exact same thing to her by the end of this episode. But he then also conveniently hits the button, allowing him to bring 5 players with him, and through this he takes Katie's alliance, to which he starts to do some really good work going undercover here, getting in their good graces, despite him still planning on taking them out at the first opportunity. We also get the reveal of the panic room, which was pointless and leads to a boring task. We do also get a lot of talk from Ari about being worried about Dan, and shockingly, he wins the nomination challenge where he ends up targeting Dan, putting him on the block against Mel and using Marley as a pawn here. Now I will say that again, it felt like production was really helping Dan out here with him hitting the button right before a nomination challenge, allowing him to fast track all the way to the final round, but obviously Ari ends up beating him despite that. But at this point, Katie's alliance seemed to be fully on board with bringing Dan in and getting rid of Mel as the bigger target. And while Mel does end up putting on a decent fight here by going to the floaters and telling them to use her and actually gets Sid to campaign for her for a while, it doesn't really end up mattering and she does end up getting voted out. And Mel being this early of a boot was actually a pretty decent surprise to me, considering how her edit was pretty early on and how focused it was in giving her this like really sympathetic edit. It did feel like she was in it for the long haul, but with her being up against Dan and Marley, two people who I thought had stronger edits than hers, Mel felt like the person that we were going to be losing here. She did seem like a decent all-around player, though. I mean, she managed her threat level poorly, though that was largely because she did extremely well in competitions, and also her having a really great backstory. But outside of that, I don't think she played that poorly. I mean, she was willing to be self-interested when her alliance was crumbling, and she probably had high win equity if she did get to the end. So, I mean, I think Mel ended up being a better player than I was expecting, and like, to be honest, I was expecting to be annoyed by Mel at the beginning of the season, but by the end of it here, I actually did like her quite a bit. And was sad to see her go. Now for episode 11, which is probably one of the better episodes of the season, where at this point, Dan has fully infiltrated Katie's alliance, and we do get a lot of focus on that, though during the shopping task, we do have Dan getting this side task to sabotage the shopping task to get a phone call with Nick, which was bizarre. To be getting a phone call with a previous player that was just voted out not too long ago, but really you could clearly tell that Dan was more so doing this to make good TV, more so than for the actual reward. But at the end of it, Dan seemingly is convinced that he needs to go after Katie now, And this leads into the nomination challenge, where right before it, Charlotte hits the button, and instead of getting a reward like Dan did in the last episode, Charlotte instead gets taken out of the challenge and doesn't get immunity for some reason, despite every other time when someone doesn't participate in the nomination challenge, they are immune. Again, kind of BS. Thinking Dan is on their side, Katie's alliance is now targeting Ari, and when the comp is in pairs, Marley decides to team up with Dan, which from a storytelling standpoint, I always thought this duo was going to win, which they do, but with Dan being paired up with Marley, I was thinking that the Katie plan was done. Like, there's no way Marley is going to let Katie go on the block until he does, which, again, very questionable move here. I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with just Marley's personality. He's not a very confrontational sort of person. He's a people pleaser. Like, I get it. But this is still such a bad move. But with that said, like, I don't even think this was the best move for Dan to be making here as well. Like, I do think he should have stayed loyal to Katie for a little while longer. Pretty clear through the edit, at least, that she was pretty blinded to him at this point and was willing to take him a decent amount further into the game, but he really just fights so hard to get her on the block. And it's really an insane move from my perspective for Dan to be making in this situation. Again, for getting Marley, like one of Katie's closest allies, to agree for her to be a nom, and really just exposing his entire game there, not even at the halfway point of the season, is insane, but it does actually end up working for him. Especially since Katie does get voted out by the end of the episode. But there was some fun drama along the way with like Katie and Jess being so shocked at the nomination here. And I feel like it's probably made for one of the better rounds of the game, despite me thinking that Dan probably made this move a bit too rashly. But let's talk about Katie, who was the second biggest character on the season up to this point. Most of the season had been about this Dan versus Katie war and about it going back and forth throughout the season. And with her fall here, it really did feel like a bit of a different show afterwards. I mean, Katie herself seemed to be a really competent player on this season, despite her probably not being as cutthroat as I would like her to be. But I do think she did some impressive work here, with her starting off on the outs, but rebuilding a majority alliance and getting the floaters to stick to her side for a decently long time. Obviously, her major weakness is her trusting Dan at the end, but I do think coming out of the season, I do think of her as one of the better players on this cast. And with that, let's move on to episode 12, which again feels like a new show at this point. But to further boon that opinion, for the next 2 weeks of the show, they decide to radically change the format. That does lead to some pretty stale episodes moving forward. But this episode does start off with some interesting strategy from Ari, where we learn that despite him acting like this spoiled rich kid, it turns out that he isn't that rich, and is only playing up this character to get people to take him to the end with the intention of him still being able to win the public vote at the end, with the audience now being in on the fact that he is not actually rich. I did actually feel like this was pretty innovative strategy in a game like this, where you have this social strategy game for the majority of it, just for it to end in a public vote. I do wonder if more people are going to be trying this moving forward. But with us being at the top 10, the halfway point, theoretically, the players do get a feast, and this is where we get introduced to the Intruders, who strangely make their first appearances here as heads on a platter at the dinner table, which seemed like a really twisted way of adding them to the game. And just the element of adding new players here so late into the game was such a terrible decision in my eyes, with most of them just coming off as fodder for later in the season, just bloating this season out. And while meeting these new players, both Dan and Jess use this as an opportunity to rebuild their armies, with Dan picking up Adriana and Brenton, while Jess ends up picking up Mitch. But this is also where we do learn the format for the week, which brings the entire season to a halt, where for the rest of the week, the older players are going to be immune, while this week's events will determine which 4 of these 6 new players will be staying in the game. There will be 2 rounds where there will be immunity challenges, where the winners of those get to stay in the game automatically. Afterwards, the formal players will get to vote one of the new players into the game. Again, all of this just felt like a way to pad out this season. Mitch ends up winning the first challenge here, and the vote does come down to a war between the floaters and Dan, where the floaters want to keep in Gabe, while Dan wants to keep in Adriana, leading to Dan deciding to work with Jess in order to keep Adriana in the game, which seems to bring Dan and Jess together, where they team up for the next few rounds and seem to be working in lockstep, despite them obviously having some hostility at the beginning of this episode due to the fact that he just blindsided Katie. And with that, let's get to episode 13, where we pretty much get the exact same storylines from the previous episode. The floaters once again want to keep Gabe in the game, while now Dan is trying to formally align with Jess. We do see more of the Brenton Christina showmance that was getting set up last episode, but really from this point forward, this becomes such a prominent storyline on the season, I really just didn't care about any of it. Again, this was Christina's third showmance on this season, so I'd already seen this before, but to make it even worse here is that Brenton himself is just such a boring character to me, and I really didn't care about it because, again, like, he literally just entered the game. Again, for me, this showmance storyline that becomes such a focal point for the next, 2 weeks of the show just didn't work for me. I actually did like the task that was in this episode, though that was booned by this fun Dan and Sid dynamic of them having to set up 2,000 dominoes and Dan just messing it up constantly. Though the punishment for failing it was just really dumb, where they got to choose 2 people that would be forced to become security guards together for the night, and obviously they picked Brenton and Christina, and whatever, it's boring, showman stuff, whatever. After this, we do get the next immunity challenge, which was this really physical comp, and considering who was competing in it, it was very obvious Brenton was going to win it. And with that, at least one of the twins are going home here, so we do end up having Charlotte deciding to give up her game to get Alex voted into the game, as Alex was the bigger fan and supposedly had a love for strategy. So the vote does end up coming down to Alex versus Gabe, but Gabe this time does win out, but really, who cares? Especially considering we get this reveal at the end of the episode that the 2 not voted in here, which were the 2 twins, will now compete in a competition where one of them will re-enter the game. And again, who cares? This is all dumb. They're really just stretching out this season. What's even more bizarre about this is the fact that in this episode we get so much setup about how Alex cares so much more about the game, only for us to see in the next episode where the challenge plays out that Alex ends up dropping to give Charlotte a chance in the game, which is the exact opposite of what we were set up in this episode. None of this ends up making sense. It's so dumb. Well, with that said, let's talk about Alex, who was there. She was a twin. Not much else to say there. While she did get a decent amount of airtime considering her short stay in the house, nothing really stands out about her other than the fact that she was supposedly a super fan of BBAU. But at the end of the day, again, don't have much to say. Let's jump to episode 14, where again we had the challenge, blah blah blah, Alex goes home. We also get the shopping task that was pretty fun of them having to make sure that Tilly stays as still as possible, and they put this step counter on her, and they would lose money from their budget the more steps she took, and it was just hilarious to see the players decide to carry her around, not realizing that by carrying her around, the step tracker will still pick up on their steps, which ended up in them losing most of their money anyway. We do also get this segment where we see SJ sneaking away food and eating in secret, which she gets this really positive edit for doing so. It's like she's stealing food. You would think this would be a negative. Everyone in the house is complaining about how hungry they are, and you just have SJ hogging up the food to herself. But really, just in general, this edit on this season seemed to be overwhelmingly positive for SJ, which I did find nauseating at points. We do get to the Nom Challenge where Mitch ends up winning, and he does continue to win a lot of competitions on this season, which puts this massive target on his back. But coming into this round, Ari is the target, and Mitch ends up putting up Ari along with Charlotte H., who is his closest ally, and then also Gabe as an easy pawn. But during the Nom Challenge, Ari's balloon ends up having a hole in it, which leads to production deciding to just give him immunity. Again, it's just handing out immunity left and right, except when Charlotte H is involved. But instead of making Mitch renom, they just make the final vote between Charlotte H and Gabe. And this is where we start to get a lot of talk about Gabe being depressed and not wanting to be there. But with Charlotte being aligned with Ari, she still ends up getting voted out here, though it is a really close vote. But after Charlotte leaves, Gabe announces to the rest of the house that he is also just going to quit the game, which made this a really weird ending to this episode. Let's talk about the boots here, starting off with Charlotte H. She was there. And I really felt like production had it out for her, considering how she by far got the least amount of airtime, considering how long she was in the game, where again, outside of her being a stylist and her being friends with Ari, don't know much about her. And I think from a gameplay perspective, she also just didn't seem to be playing that hard, so she really didn't do much on the show. And then we have Gabe, who simply shouldn't have been on the show. It really feels like he was someone that was just not made for reality TV. He seems like a nice guy, but he didn't really seem to have the drive in him to do anything within the game. And despite him seeming to find some easy allies in the game, namely in someone like a Sid,
I don't feel like he was mentally fit to be in the game, as he just kind of crumbles once he realizes he isn't in the main power structure. Again, he seems like a nice guy, but probably just shouldn't have been cast. And now for episode 15, where the next few episodes are almost entirely focused around this Brenton Christina showmance, and to add to that, we also get this really dumb format for the week, which we will talk about a bit later, but the showmance becomes a massive target here, with the majority alliance wanting to split them up. We do also have this ridiculous task where players have to carry their rewards from one side of the backyard to the other while being electrocuted, and I found that really strange. They made Mitch do it with twice the amount of electricity for no real reason. But after this, we do get this storyline with Ari of him trying to put the target onto Brenton by creating this lie about him wasting the peanut butter, and I love how the show portrays this in such a positive light, despite the fact that it's very clear this plan backfired on him. We do get to the Nom Challenge, where we do get another random draw for immunity for whatever reason, to which Charlotte ends up getting that, and the rest of the players do play in pairs, where Mitch and Marley end up winning the challenge, and do end up targeting Ari, but do put Christina and Adriana alongside him, and with the majority of the house being so gung-ho about splitting up the showmance, the target does get switched on to Christina, and she does end up getting voted out. Until we learn about the dumb twist for the week, where Christina is going to become the Walking Dead, and the next player voted out will end up joining her, with those two being instantly nominated for the final round of the week, where only one person will go home this entire week. Again, really dragging out this season, but also really lessening the stakes of the next episode, though it technically plays out in the best possible way. Let's move on to episode 16, where Christina gets a lot of content about her wanting revenge, and they still manage to focus on her showmance despite them being split apart, with there being a hole in the wall that they can interact through. But with Jess being the main orchestrator of the previous move, we do get a lot of content here of the show trying to show Jess as this really cocky, domineering figure, despite the fact that you can clearly tell that she was joking around when she was saying these things like she's running the game. But again, the show takes it super seriously. But we do also see Dan in this episode finally decide to flip against Jess, which again for me was really terrible timing. I think he should have just waited for a week where there wasn't this twist going around. But I mean, to be fair, again, it made for better TV. It made this episode actually matter. We do get a task for videos from home where Mitch once again wins it here, along with Charlotte. Though I did like the move of them giving it away to some of the OG players, though again, it doesn't really amount to much. We then get more Tilly content of her wanting to target Mitch here. So again, I wonder who's going to win the nomination challenge. But really, in this episode, we see pretty much everyone turn against Jess here, with SJ doing a lot of work to make sure that this plan follows through and re-solidifying her relationship with Dan. As I said, Tilly wins the nomination challenge and puts up Ari, Brenton, and Mitch, and the vote is between Brenton and Mitch. And while Sid does throw a hinky vote, making the vote a bit closer than expected, Mitch does end up getting voted out here. And that leads to episode 17, where someone will finally go home. But before that, we do have a dumb task of counting every bird in the house, which they end up failing anyway. Again, who cares? We then get Dan finally going to Jess to tell her what happened at the Mitch vote, to which he straight up just tells her that he wants to leave her alliance and that he would probably nominate her if he wins. Again, I love Dan as a character, but this is such a sloppy move to be making from a gameplay perspective. It makes him a pretty clear target for Jess's side moving forward, and really just starts this Dan versus Jess war, which felt like a retread of the Dan versus Katie war that we had previously. But we do get to the Nom Challenge, where it's another endurance challenge that's pretty clear Tilly is going to win, though through this, SJ gets this really heroic edit where she comes in second, where she has to have the crew help her get down and everything. It really didn't do anything for me. And I found it weird that Tilly, being the nominator here, is only responsible to nominate the final nom, where Christina and Mitch are already nominated from being The Walking Dead, which kind of makes this entire round kind of pointless, as we're essentially just getting the exact same vote again, where she does end up picking Brenton, and it becomes Brenton versus Mitch again, and we get the exact same vote from the previous episode where Mitchell does get voted out again, but this time with even more votes. And Mitch was fine. I mean, I was expecting him to be this big douchey bro, but he seemed to be a nice guy. I mean, he had no real sense of the strategy of the game. I mean, he just won comp after comp after comp, just making himself a bigger target. And he does pretty much get taken out at the first opportunity they get, but he did do good work in bonding with Jess and Marley, though obviously at the end of the day, not enough to keep him in the game. Now jump to episode 18, where thankfully the format returns to normal, even though I don't even like this original format, but it's still better than what we've been getting. We do get a boring task of them having to go to boot camp and carrying bags of potatoes in order to win steak and chips, which literally ends up being the exact same thing they've already done in Australian Survivor, and them faking them out by giving them a bag of potatoes instead of actual chips. Though Dan does get a secret task during this of him having to pretend to be carrying a bag of potatoes while in reality he's carrying a light bag of balls, and through that he gets the actual steak and chips, which, again, pretty much feels like Dan's MO on this season. We do get more of the Dan and Jess war that gets subsided when they end up playing in teams for the nomination challenge, which made it pretty much impossible for those two to be nominated, as both had people fighting for them, and they do end up both being on the same team, but both end up being safe as the other team agrees to target Brenton and Christina once again and put up SJ as a pawn. And it really felt like Brenton was going home here, as the show really tried to bring up scenarios for him to stay, but if you paid attention, like, he never had more than 6 votes, even in all of these scenarios. Like, there was never a scenario where he actually had the majority. And also with the show even showing Dan wavering at the end, leading to him throwing away his vote anyway, again, felt pretty confident that Brenton was going home here. And again, Brenton was there. He was in a showmance. That's his story. He cooked a lot. That was something. I found Brenton so boring. Again, another likable enough guy. He seems like a nice guy, but also just didn't bring anything to the table for me on this season. His showmance with Christina just hogged up the airtime, and I really just didn't care the entire way through. But now for episode 19, which starts off with a pretty boring panic room task, but one player does end up being left out of it. Conveniently, that person ends up being Dan. Who would have guessed that? And he conveniently gets an advantage for being the person left out, where he gets a survival kit. Again, pretty much taken from Australian Survivor, of him getting a stash of food that he can use to barter with, but also he gets a game advantage as well, where he can take down any of the 3 nominees, essentially giving himself immunity if he needs it for this round, which again felt very suspicious that Dan keeps on getting these advantages over and over and over again. But outside of that, the episode does make it pretty clear that Jess is going home here, with 2 prominent storylines coming into the nomination challenge being that Dan has created this squeeze plan, which he acts as if it's this new, like, innovative strategy when it's literally just putting 2 pawns on the block against a massive target in Jess, which they've done previously on this season. Like, I don't get why this is even a thing to even show on the show, especially because it doesn't amount to anything. But we do get a lot of Christina content as well, with her wanting revenge, and she unsurprisingly wins the nomination challenge and targets Jess. Though I do think she puts up 2 very questionable pawns in SJ and Ari, who I feel like both of which had a chance of going home here. But with Dan's power, he does end up saving Ari, who did seem to be getting a decent chunk of the votes coming into the vote. And we do get this fun, like, ridiculous segment of Dan trying to sneak Ari into the cave and running around the room frantically. But I love how everyone is just confused as they enter the eviction room, and you can see people like Jess and Marley freaking out. Though I will say, I don't like how they revealed to everyone that Dan was the one that did this, and even showed them footage of him sneaking Ari away, which really just perpetuates this idea that he's this schemy guy, which again, he is, but I don't like that production themselves are essentially revealing that to everyone. But the vote really seemed to be up in the air, with Mary ending up as the swing vote here, and it does end up in a 4-3 vote where Jess gets voted out. And I really loved how this episode didn't even end there, where we do end up seeing Ari returning to the game through the couch, where you do see Marley, Tilly, and Mary still mourning the loss of Jess, just for Ari to return to the game afterwards. That was just hilarious for me. But let's talk about Jess, whose boot has been a long time coming at this point. I mean, it seemed like her edit was getting a lot of negativity towards the end of the run here, to where it was really showing her as this really overconfident figure, despite her clearly not being so. Like, it really felt like they were trying to shoehorn that story in there. Just pretty much just played the Katie role after Katie left. I mean, having taken control of Katie's alliance and trying to work with Dan again just for Dan to turn against her again. And she really should have seen this coming. But even despite that, I mean, she did also get very unlucky with certain comp results and also with Dan's advantage here, where despite all those things, she almost does stay here. I mean, I do think Jess is another one of the better players on this season. I mean, she was good at comp, she was good socially, And while she does have some faulty strategy at points, she did seem to be willing to make deals just to turn on them. So, I mean, at least that's something. While I never found her to be that interesting of a character, I mean, she does play a massive role on this season and seemed to also be a confident player. And now let's jump into episode 20, which mostly revolves around a new rivalry here between Christina and Marley, who are now coming after each other, with Marley now being the leader of Jess's former army, which was Katie's former army, while Christina is now out in front due to her move from the previous episode. Along the way, we do have a dumb shopping task revolving around spinning in a wheel. Again, found that boring, but when we get to the Nom Challenge where they're forced to work in pairs, it really propped up this Sid and Marley versus Ari and Christina battle, where Sid does drop out of nowhere, meaning that Ari and Christina win the challenge, and they do make the pretty obvious move here of nominating Marley against two pawns in SJ and Mary, who you would assume wouldn't vote for each other as they are extremely close. And Mary having just voted out Jess over SJ, again making it seem like she would probably do the same thing here against Marley. But we do find out that Mary has decided to turn against SJ in order to save Marley, which is probably the right move for her, to be honest. I mean, Marley is someone that has less room to maneuver, as he is such a big target and really has almost no chance of really working with the other side, unlike SJ. But through that, though, it makes it pretty clear that the vote is going to land on SJ, who does at least fight in the eviction room, and that was nice to see, but she does end up getting voted out, only for it to turn out that this is another non-elimination round. Again, the second time that she gets saved by this. But here, SJ, the voted out player, will now become the head of house, essentially playing a similar role to what Angela did in the last season when she was voted out. But she also gets to take someone with her, and conveniently she takes Dan, because obviously the season has to revolve around him. But I did like a lot of this episode, actually, and did find it to be a pretty interesting round, but I felt like having SJ stay anyway did lead to it being kind of underwhelming.
Now for episode 21, where a lot of the episode revolves around SJ and Dan, with them now controlling some of the tasks, and I really found a lot of this pretty lame, with nothing of note really coming from this. We then get a house task where each player can individually win a ticket to a cocktail party with SJ and Dan, to which Marley is one of the winners, and during this party we get the strategy ramping up a bit, where Dan and Marley make a deal to not target each other and instead be willing to let go of some of their own alliance members, with Marley targeting Ari and Christina, while Dan targets Charlotte and Mary. And we then get the nomination challenge where SJ and Dan are again handed immunity, because why not, I guess? And through this, I really thought it was clear that Marley was winning this challenge, as they really didn't set up any other option. And afterwards, we do get continuous clips from pretty much everyone talking about how he's going to nominate Ari, Christina, and Adriana, where even Dan doesn't think he's going to fall through with the deal to put Mary up, but he does. And through this, I again thought it was pretty clear that Mary was going to be blindsided here, especially when Christina ends up getting targeted over Ari in an episode where Christina got no content. But we do get a lot of focus on Dan's plan here to blindside Mary, where we do see him and SJ counting up the numbers, and Dan pulling over Ari, Christina, and Adriana, telling them to pretend that they're going home. And this is all pretty fun, but again, clearly Mary was going home here, and we do see Mary getting really upset with Marley, to the point where even in the eviction room, she's still talking bad about him. But Mary does get blindsided here in a 5-4 vote, where we do get some pretty great reactions, with this probably being one of the better blindsides on the season from a TV perspective, even though it was pretty foreshown in the edit. But let's talk about Mary, who is fine. I mean, I didn't find her that interesting of TV. She just played this mother role on the season. She was somewhat willing to play the game, though didn't end up playing that well, and while both times she gets voted out here, it is due to some sort of twist, where she first had the fake double, and now she gets screwed from SJ returning to the game, as again the numbers wouldn't have worked out here without her. But I don't really think she had a real chance of winning this game, and was mostly there just to propel other people's games. Now for episode 22, where again, a lot of this episode does focus around Dan and SJ once again. Firstly, of them getting to mess with the other players by getting Tilly to make them breakfast. and the other players having to do this task where they have to stay in a car for hours. From a gameplay perspective, though, we do have Dan and SJ facing the ramifications of the Mary boot, and it was really surprising to me to see Dan want to actually remain loyal to Marley here and was genuinely talking about wanting to let Christina go in order to maintain Marley's loyalty, which did feel like the wrong move to make here, especially where Dan's alliance has the upper hand at this point and the perception that Marley is a big threat. Though moving forward, Marley does actually remain loyal to him, so it might not have been the worst move. Now for this round, SJ and Dan are once again given immunity for the round for, again, no real reason. But they also get another pretty ridiculous advantage in them getting to pick the third nominee for the week, which just felt so overpowered, especially in this sort of split house. So we do have Tilly winning the nomination challenge, which was a variation of the Coconut Chop Challenge from Survivor and did lead to Dan's alliance getting taken out one after another due to Dan and SJ not being in the competition, meaning Marley's alliance had the numbers. But with Tilly winning here, she does nominate Christina and Adriana, two of Dan's alliance members, but because of Dan and SJ's advantage, they get to nominate Charlotte, who essentially leaves us in the same position as last episode, where it's Christina versus one of Marley's alliance members, and we do once again get the setup of Ari being a potential swing vote, and Dan also gets set up as a potential swing vote, but you could clearly tell with him talking about how big of a threat Charlotte was, it was pretty clear that was where he was heading, and we do lose Charlotte in a 5-3 vote, and Charlotte, again, was there. I mean, her edit was really unfortunate, where when she first came in, she did get a decent amount of airtime, particularly around her relationship with Alex. But once Alex goes, her edit goes along with it, and she barely gets any content for the rest of the season. Really until this episode where she gets shown as this airhead and gets shown just rambling on about shopping while SJ talks about floaters in the game. It really felt like the editors were really just throwing her under the bus. Though even outside of that, it does feel like she didn't really have that much to actually do here either. She did seem to be loyal to Marley and was unwavering in that, and because of that, it didn't really seem like she had much going on within the game. Now for episode 23, which was mostly boring as it ends up being another non-elimination episode. Here we do see Ari getting a secret task that in itself was boring. Essentially, he just had to talk to these people about certain topics. But then Tilly gets a secret task to ruin his secret task, and that was also pretty boring. We follow that up with everyone getting phone calls from home for some reason. But gameplay-wise, we do get a lot of focus around Marley from two different perspectives. First, we see it through his relationship with Sid, which was never really focused on until now, but all of a sudden they're best bros. But also through Dan wanting to work with Marley once again, and Tilly getting a lot of credit here in trying to bring the two together, which they eventually make a final three to, which I'll be honest, at this point in the season, I was thinking that they would be the final three. I felt like for me it made narrative sense for them to be the final three of the season, though obviously that doesn't end up playing out. Sid also gets in trouble in this episode with him kind of blowing up his own spot by going to Christina in an attempt to get the target onto Marley, which gets back around to Marley, and through his Sid gets set up as a pretty obvious boot for this episode, until we found out at the nom challenge that no one is going home here, and instead the winner of the comp will be nominated for a chance to win an advantage along with two people of their choosing, which again really feels like they're dragging out the season. But Dan does it winning the competition, and it's pretty clear here that Marley's going to be getting the advantage through all the setup we've been getting within the episode, where Dan does select Marley along with SJ, but it's also done that SJ pretty much immediately tells everyone that she doesn't want it. She wants to get to the end with her own merit, and again, terrible strategy here, but we do learn that the advantage is the eye, which is essentially just an idol from Survivor. Last two rounds ends up being pointless. The vote is pretty close though. However, Ari does end up making a deal with Marley in order to have Marley protect him moving forward, so Marley does get the advantage here. And now we jump to episode 24, where a lot of this episode revolves around Sid and him still talking about making this big move, which I thought all of this was a joke coming into this episode, but it does actually happen, where he does win the nomination challenge. He does put up two of his former allies in Marley and Tilly, along with Dan, as someone who he currently has no game relationship with. Again, putting up this final three that we just saw form that, again, I really thought was getting to the end. We do also get some talk about flushing the eye, where Ari gets a lot of credit here in trying to get Marley to use it, which again is really, at the end of the day, just a basic strategy that we've seen in Survivor for years.
and Marley does end up using it. So again, that twist was entirely pointless. And after this, we do get a lot of Dan and Tilly both wanting to go home in order to keep the other in the game, which really comes out left field as, I mean, yeah, we knew they were close, but not that close to the point where they were literally telling other people to vote them out. But we do get to the vote where we do have an interesting vote here in a 3-2 vote where Ari, Christina, and Adriana are the votes to get Tilly out. But guess what? It's all for nothing because we get another non-elimination episode for no reason. I don't get what they're doing with this season. Like, it's really ridiculous that out of the entire group at this point, at the final 8, only 2 people, Sid and Marley, have not been saved by a twist. It's kind of ridiculous. Let's jump to episode 25, where Tilly enters the mirror room, where she is stuck in this room with a chance to re-enter the game, blah, blah, blah. It was boring. No intrigue there. We did also get a memory task where the winner got a game advantage, which obviously there's not enough of in this game. But SJ ends up winning it, and it ends up being a non-challenge replay, where if SJ doesn't like the results of the challenge, she can choose to replay it. And this is so pointless. This is such a bad twist, and it really just wastes time on the show, as again, it doesn't end up mattering. Now, right before challenge, we do get this content that, again, comes out of nowhere of SJ being extremely close to Marley. With Christina winning the challenge, someone that would target Marley, SJ decides to use her power, pissing off her entire alliance, just to have Adriana win the challenge anyway, which leads to pretty much the same result. But even worse for SJ now, with Adriana now wanting to target SJ for using the advantage and using Marley and Ari as pawns, with the later of those being a massive mistake. Again, Ari being a massive ally of hers, and really just opening up the opportunity for him to leave, especially with Dan and SJ seemingly siding with Marley, making Sid the swing vote here, and he does end up voting out Ari. And what is portrayed as this like massive blindside, but again, the editing was pretty straightforward here, though Christina, Ari, and Adriana are completely shocked. Again, I don't get how they didn't see this coming, considering how blatantly close Dan and SJ are. And also how, like, even Sid saw that Dan and Marley were coming together. So I don't get how they didn't see this coming. Plus, also, I mean, it's Dan. They should have seen this coming. But we end the episode of Ari meeting up with Tilly in the mirror room, leading us to episode 26, which was another pretty boring episode, as again, pretty much nothing happens here. We get more setup of Sid being targeted. We get a reward challenge for $10,000 that Mari wins, because why not? We also get a lot of boring segments showing Ari and Tilly playing it up for the camera, also known as losing their minds in the mirror room. And we literally end the episode with an over 10-minute segment of them randomly picking boxes in the challenge to return, which was entirely luck-based. Though through this, Tilly is eliminated, Ari wins, yay. But let's talk about Tilly, who, I'll be honest, I was really surprised by her exit here. I mean, not by the time of this episode, obviously, as the edit does make it pretty clear that Tilly was going home, but just in general, as I did think that the Dan, Marley, Tilly alliance was a setup for them getting to the end. I did feel like her vote out felt a bit anticlimactic, but she was a fun character. I mean, nothing entirely new. We've already seen versions of her archetype in the past. She reminds me a lot of Sky from BBAU 11. But I did think that Tilly had an interesting strategy, fully committing to this like meat shield strat with her going for people in the middle while the bigger players go after each other. I think the problem for her was how much of a target she ended up being herself by winning so many competitions. But now let's jump into episode 27, where a lot of the focus is put onto Ari, who seems to genuinely want to work with Marley and Dan after being told to do so by Tilly in the mirror room, to which they end up making a deal. We do also have more setup for this Dan versus Sid battle, only for them to also make a deal to not target each other. And they end up being the final two in a non-challenge, where Sid ends up throwing it to Dan, and Dan does stay true to his deal, putting up the 3 women. But it's here where we also get another twist thrown into the game, which was first labeled as this being second chance week. And I was like, isn't that what the last few weeks have been? Instead, here we do get a twist that I know gets mentioned for BBUS quite a bit, where the nominator will get to nominate 3 players, but then there'll be a competition where the nominees compete and the winner gets safety, and the vote is now between the other 2. And I would have still preferred like a veto, as that has so much more potential to stir things up, but whatever. It wastes more time. SJ wins the comp. leaving it between Adriana and Christina, to where I felt like it was pretty clear Adriana was going home, as Adriana has this massive visibility spike here, though Christina has been like the biggest threat for quite a while in the game. But we do see Christina campaigning pretty well here, where she does pull on everyone's heartstrings to get people like Marley and Sid to agree to keep her, to which she does end up staying unanimously here, meaning we lose Adriana, the final intruder of the season, and that made that twist feel really pointless. That again just prolonged the season, made it a massive drag. None of the intruders end up adding that much of interest anyway. Now, in terms of Adriana, I do like Adriana. She seems like a genuinely nice person, but again, didn't really do much on the show outside of her relationship with Dan. Now for episode 28, which starts off with a lot of focus around Christina, with her now going after Dan, and unsurprisingly, she wins the nomination challenge, nominating Dan alongside Ari and Sid, keeping both SJ and Marley safe, which is really questionable, as, again, to me, those two feel like the very clear frontrunners to win a public vote. But the episode really seemed to lean into Dan being the possible boot here, but he does end up winning this safety comp. And with that, we have Ari and Sid on the block, where Dan is all in on taking out Sid while Marley wants to save him. This does leave SJ as the swing vote, and while the show does try to say it's up in the air, it felt pretty clear to me that, again, Sid was going home, where we see SJ talking to both of the nominees, and we see her promising Ari that he's safe, which she never ends up doing for Sid. So it's pretty obvious that Sid was getting voted out here, and this was a long time coming. I mean, Sid was getting this downfall edit for the last few weeks of the show, and he finally gets taken out here, but due to none of the setup that they had been giving us, where like Marley, Dan, and Ari were all given reasons to take out Sid, but it ends up being people like Christina and SJ that get credited for the reason why he goes home. But Sid does seem like a likable guy, though also probably one of the more bland figures on the season. He seems like a competent enough player in every aspect. He's willing to throw his allies on their bus in order to save himself, which is something he can't really say for a lot of the players on this cast. So again, a solid player, but just kind of boring on the show. Now for episode 29, where we see Ari and Christina coming together in an alliance of convenience, with the plan being to target Dan, and right from the beginning, I pegged this as Dan's boot episode. I mean, Dan is someone that clearly dominated the airtime on this season. We've had so many Dan boot fake outs throughout the season, but I did feel like the edit had been slowly setting up his potential boot to where by this episode, I did feel like it was finally coming. But here we do see the dynamics of the house, where Dan, Marley, and SJ clearly have a final three, and Ari and Christina plan on nominating Dan and SJ, which does end up happening. And if that was the case, again, it felt like that was probably where Dan would go home. Though at the nomination challenge, we do get this bizarre change in the format once again, which instead of having only one nomination challenge, it turns out we're going to have two separate nomination challenges, where the winner of each challenge gets to nominate one person, essentially giving the majority two chances here to control the vote. And this definitely felt like something they did to try to keep this Dan, SJ, Marley group together. But obviously it doesn't end up working out for him, because Christina wins the first comp, puts up SJ, and Ari wins the second comp and puts up Dan. And it's here where Christina becomes the swing vote. And for me, I was never convinced that she was going to do anything other than vote out Dan here, considering how much setup we've had from her in previous episodes about her targeting Dan. And because that Dan does get blindsided here, and Dan really made the show. I do think without Dan being as great of a character as he was, I probably would have given up on the show, because a good chunk of this season did really focus on him, and his run on the season was really interesting to watch. Him starting off with that cold-blooded Max move, him being able to take control of the game until Katie undercuts him, and then he loses his entire alliance until he blindsides Katie, gets back with Katie's allies just to eventually blindside Jess as well, and then reach this endgame working with people he has worked against at points in the game. I mean, he does have a pretty riveting run here, and while he definitely benefited from twists and possible production influence, he did make this season as good as it was.
Now for episode 30, which, how this season ended up being this long. But this is the final normal episode of the season, where we're at the final four. And early on, we do get so much filler, with each player getting our game recap, each of them getting a video call from home. We get them reminiscing about the season, get them talking about why they want to win. all this came off as so boring to me. But we do get to the final nomination challenge where it really comes down to this insanely difficult table maze that I can't even imagine having the patience to do. But Marley ends up winning it despite Ari having a pretty huge head start. And really, I felt like this entire episode felt like a Marley coronation. Now, Marley was my winner pick, and throughout the season, I did feel like he was the most likely winner from an edit standpoint. But here, I really felt like the producers went overboard with them trying to make him the winner, similar to how they treated Chad last season. But when it comes down to the vote, I mean, I was pretty sure it was going to be Ari getting voted out here. Ari does try to campaign to get rid of SJ, which really didn't seem plausible. So we do end up losing Ari here, who was another massive figure on the season. I mean, I think outside of Dan, Ari's probably the next biggest character here. He was certainly the most strategically active player. Now, while being the most active strategic player, I don't think that necessarily means he played well most of the time, with it seeming like the house wanted him out at numerous points throughout the season due to his blatant scheminess. But I do think he has some interesting ideas, like him pretending to be rich to the players, only to tell the audience the truth. And while Ari's shtick did get a bit old by the end of the season, he was definitely one of the more memorable figures here. And now we get to the finale, which was essentially just a reunion show, which they did last season as well. And I mean, it's kind of boring. I really don't care. I really just want to know who the winner is. So we do have the final three of Marley, Christina, and SJ. And obviously we have this terrible format of the winner being decided by a public vote. And while I do think that any of the three could have potentially won here, again, for me, I just felt like Marley was the type of person that the Australian public was going to vote for. And they do. He wins. How surprising. But with that, let's wrap up the video by talking about each of the final three, starting out with the runners-up. So first we'll talk about Christina, who definitely had a slow start on the season, with most of her early content being about her numerous showmances, but I did feel like she was pretty likable once Brenton left, with her being this underdog that won some pretty clutch competitions and did some good social work to repair her relationships with Ari and Marley that did get her to the end. Now, obviously, she did get voted out of the game and got saved by this Walking Dead twist. So again, I'm not saying that she's that good of a player, though she did have some agency within the game, especially in the back half. Though character-wise, I think she's just fine. I mean, I did like her DR celebrations after winning comps, but outside of that, she didn't really stand out that much as a character here. Next up, we do have SJ, who I felt like the show was really trying to prop her up as this inspiration for older women, and I just felt like the editing here was super heavy-handed. Plus, also, it really seemed pretty clear that a lot of people were just annoyed with her while on the show, especially during the early portions of the game. It reminded me a lot of the Jane Bright situation from Survivor Nicaragua, where again, Jane Bright was portrayed as this fan favorite figure despite her not being well liked within the game, and I feel like SJ got a similar style of edit. But also, gameplay wise, while SJ did seem to have some gumption to make some moves within the game, I do think for the most part, she just got really lucky throughout this season, with twists saving her on multiple occasions and putting her back into a better position. Like, if it wasn't for the fact that she was saved by that fake double eviction, she would have just been a pretty forgettable early boot. But because of that, and then also the twist where she becomes the head of house, her game essentially got reset and puts her in a pretty strong position afterwards. So really for me, I didn't really click with SJ on any aspect on the show, despite the show very clearly wanting you to. And finally, let's talk about the winner in Marley, who for me was such a clear frontrunner from very early on. I mean, the editing here was, again, really heavy-handed in making him this sympathetic figure with his constant talk about his parents. Though, despite how heavy-handed it was there, I do feel like Marley just seems like this genuinely nice guy. He really does seem like a good person, and to see someone like him win is still a satisfying outcome in my eyes, despite him being kind of a bland character. Like, while likable, he never really brings that much entertainment to the show in the DR, and really just comes off as kind of boring. But I will say that gameplay-wise, I think Marley easily played the best game of the season. I mean, he's the only person to reach the end game here to not directly be saved by a twist, which again is ridiculous on its own, but also considering how well positioned he was throughout the game, with him being able to win back some of his biggest enemies in the game and get them to want to take him to the end, That's also pretty insane. I mean, these bonds that he made with Dan and Christina gave him such an easy path to the end without even having to face that much adversity. Now, I do question how much of this gameplay was active and how much of it was solely due to him being this naturally likable guy, but for me, Marley by far plays the best game on this season, with him having so many mate shields in front of him early on, with people like Chris, Katie, and Jess being taken out. And once all of them go, he had already built up so many bonds that would pretty much save him in any nomination scenario. So while he may not be the most interesting player or character on this season, I do think him winning here is a pretty satisfying outcome for the show. And with that, I mean, that's the entire season of BBAU, which went on for way too long. And that is my biggest complaint with this season. While I've always complained about this show's terrible format and predictable editing, I was actually enjoying myself during the first third of the season despite these flaws. But it's really after the Intruder twist where the season goes downhill, with the inclusion of these people that I don't care about and really just adding them to be fodder for later on the season, but also having a ridiculous amount of non-elimination episodes that really dragged out the season unpurposely. I did enjoy aspects of the season, namely the situations that Dan put himself in the Dan-Katie war, the Dan-Jess war, both of which having pretty spectacular outcomes. There were some great blindsides and some dynamic gameplay throughout this season, but again, the season's structure did ruin it for me. I do think this is an improvement upon the previous season, but that simply isn't saying much, and really, it's at the point where, due to how much of a commitment that this show is, and how long this video took to make, I'm thinking I'm going to drop BBAU as a show that I cover moving forward, at least as extensively as I did with this season, with this review again now being ridiculously long. I'll continue to watch the show, but I just don't know if it's worth really analyzing this show, when it's simply a show not worth analyzing, and a show I'd rather just be watching casually from this point on. So that's kind of where I'm at with BBAU. Don't expect a review of the next season if there is one. I know there is a celebrity version of the show coming later this year that I was considering covering at one point, but I think I've decided to drop that as well. Again, I'll still be watching those shows, but I do question whether it's worth making these extensive reviews on them. But with that said, that is my review of BBAU 2021. As ridiculously long as this is, thank you